Hello and welcome back to this Politics UK exclusive podcast episode. In today's show, we've got Dr. Mark Pack, the president of the Liberal Democrats, on, and he was once called one of the key thinkers on campaign tactics by The Telegraph. He was also head of innovations for the Lib Dems in the 2001 and 2005 general election, and he was also the Liberal Democrat leader for a short while whilst the party was going through a leadership election. At the moment, in his role as president, he is helping to lead the campaign by the Liberal Democrats, and we talk about many things in this episode, including if he would be happy to see his party go into coalition with the Labour Party. All this and more in this exclusive interview with Mark Pack. I first asked Mark to give us a bit of an introduction about himself.
Yeah, so I'm a president of the Liberal Democrats. I'm the first non-parliamentarian to hold the post in the party. It's a bit like the equivalent, I guess, in the Labour and Tory parties of being the party's of chairperson, chairman, chairwoman. Although, unlike the Conservative chairman, I'm not seeking office myself in the election this time.
And what do you do day to day as president of the Liberal Democrats?
It's a bit like, I guess, if somebody is the chair of the board of trustees of a charity or chair of the governors at a school. So it's not sort of day-to-day running the party in the way that the leader or the chief executive does, but hopefully providing a good sort of input on behalf of our members to the direction that we're going and how things are run.
And I'm sure you're quite busy at the moment in a general election campaign. So from a Liberal Democrat perspective, how well do you think it's going?
It seems to be going pretty well so far. It's certainly, I think, the most fun general election I've been involved in with the Liberal Democrats for quite a long time. We've had some bad general elections in recent years, but this one definitely is going a lot better. And you see that in the reaction and response there is to Ed Davey, both the stunts and the fun stuff that he's been doing, but also I think that party political broadcast a couple of weeks ago now where he sort of opened up and spoke about his own caring responsibilities within his own family and all of the pressures that he faces as a result of that. I think almost everyone I've spoken to who saw that, cried at some point watching it. So it's both the serious and the fun seem to be so far, fingers crossed, mixing together into quite a successful formula.
As well as being president of the Liberal Democrats, you're also a pollster. So how many more seats do you think the Liberal Democrats will gain at this election?
Yeah, I think one thing that the Lib Dems have set out to do very deliberately in this election is to focus on trying to win significantly more parliamentary seats and not so much focus on vote share. We've had previous elections where we've sometimes done really well on vote share, including if you go back to, say, the heydays of the Alliance, and not able to translate that into numbers of seats in the Commons. And I think this time we're sort of doing it the other way around, as it were, really concentrating on seat numbers. And you sort of saw a dry run for that almost with the local elections in May this year, where actually, although we ended up with fewer votes than Conservatives, we actually got more councillors elected than them. As a Liberal Democrat, you won't be surprised to know I could bore you for hours about all of the iniquities of the first past the post system. But if that's the electoral system we have, we might as well try and make the best of it.
So with this electoral system, how many seats do you think you'll get at this election?
I'm confident we'll go up, and it's up to the voters in their wisdom to determine what the number is.
And why do you think more and more people, especially those who voted Tory in the past, are actually going to the Liberal Democrats instead of the Labour Party?
Yeah. I think it's probably twofold. One is there is just a real level of exasperation, anger, disappointment at the government. I find it a lot when I've been canvassing and you talk to people who say, well, I always used to vote Conservative, but... and then they just sigh or shrug their shoulder. It's not like it's one specific policy issue or one specific person, but a much broader sense of sort of anger and disappointment. And then there's a question about, why the Liberal Democrats? And obviously, sometimes that's because we're the clearest challengers, as in many seats for the Conservatives, so there's a tactical element to that. But also, I think what people have maybe slightly surprised themselves to the extent to which they've warmed to Ed Davey as they've sort of seen the stunts, heard about his personal sort of backstory, and, have liked what they've sort of seen. Because I think, one of the things that voters actually, I think, are quite savvy about is that when you're choosing who to vote for, you are in part choosing what's the sort of person that you want in office. person that you want to give some power to? What's the sort of person that you hope will reflect your values, your concerns? And so in that sense, Ed's personal story, his commitment, his deep commitment to improving social care, I think resonates really well because, so many millions of us have some experience of caring as well ourselves.
And we can't talk about the Liberal Democrats campaign so far without talking about all the stunts Ed Davey and the senior leaders in the Liberal Democrats have done. I mean, how many times has Ed Davey jumped into water in this election? Do you think it conveys a message to voters that the Liberal Democrats aren't a serious party, or are you doing politics in a fun way that resonates with voters?
Yeah, I think most people perhaps understandably don't pay that much attention to politics most of the time, so there's definitely a necessary role for sort of catching people's attention a little bit, but also I think showing that you don't take yourself too seriously, you're not really pompous and up yourself and so on, does convey the sort of person, the sort of personality that I think a lot of people do want from their politicians. But you can mix, not taking yourself too seriously, with absolutely taking the issues and the concerns of people very seriously. So, the Lake Windermere incident that started it all, as it were, is clearly there was a bit of fun around, a number of times that Ed fell into the water. But of course, the reason why he was there was to help highlight the scandal of how much sewage is dumped in our waterways and in our lakes. So it's a really good example of serious but fun at the same time.
With yourself being president of the Liberal Democrats, are there any stunts coming up, or is there anything big on the campaign trail that is coming up for the Liberal Democrats?
I'm sure there will be plenty more eye-catching stunts to come, but I was in the immediate aftermath of the 2019 election because our previous party leader sadly was defeated in that election. I was briefly sort of interim joint leader of the party. I'm very glad this election campaign with all of the stunts didn't happen while I was still in that post. I would not treat falling into Lake Windermere or going on some of those roller coasters nearly as well as Ed has.
Stunts are one thing, but policy is another. What are the Liberal Democrats offering to voters that, the Labour Party aren't?
Well, I think if you compare our manifesto with Labour's, there is a real important difference in the extent to which we're willing to properly invest and make the changes that we need to help fix our social care system and our health service in particular. It's been a big priority for the party, a big personal priority for Ed Davey, and we've been willing to talk about things like how the recent Conservative tax cuts for banks should be undone, and that that's one of the ways of finding money to properly improve our public services because they've been so badly run down and badly stretched. People who work in public services are often so overrun with the level of work that's required of them that they're just not there delivering the services that we all need to be able to rely on.
Tax policy is a big issue for voters at the moment. So if the Liberal Democrats got into power on the 4th of July, would they raise taxes?
Well, we've certainly set out with our manifesto costings, I think, some very responsible, respectable ways of generating extra revenue for our public services. I mentioned the example of undoing the Tory tax cut for banks. We've also talked about, for example, reforming capital gains tax so that the very, very richest in the country would pay more through that. But that's a reasonable and fair way of generating the necessary revenue to give us all the good public services that we need. And certainly my experience of talking to former Tory voters on the doorsteps is actually plenty of them want to see better public service as well. They're not the sort of caricature right-wing, small state tax cutting people because they're worried about how long it will take for an ambulance to arrive if they have to ring 999. They know about whether it's their kids or friends of theirs, relatives of theirs, kids in schools with crumbling ceilings. They're angry about sewage being dumped in our rivers, and they understand that we can't wave a magic wand to fix all of those overnight for free. You've got to be willing to put the money in to fix those problems.
Daisy Cooper, your deputy leader, was doing the media rounds this morning, and she mentioned how she would the Liberal Democrats would put an extra £1 billion into the HMRC to make sure that people are paying the right amount of tax. Would that be targeting all classes, or would you be looking out especially for the super rich who, sometimes do some go an extra mile to pay the littlest taxes that they can?
Yeah, I think it's a really good example of how some of the the penny pinching by the current government has really been quite counterproductive, because there's lots of good expert advice and experience from other countries, and indeed from the past in Britain, that if you invest properly in HMRC, you can actually get far more money back, in extra tax revenue raised as a result than the amount of money that you've invested in the first place. I also think, just as almost aside from whether or not it ends up being a net increase in revenue, it's really important that HMRC has the resources to be a responsive organisation, so that if you've got a query about your pension arrangements and how much national insurance payments you've made, and whether you need to make some more national insurance payments, you need to be able to turn to somebody like the HMRC and get authoritative answers accurately and quickly. Martin Lewis, who does fantastic work in terms of providing financial advice to people across the country, he's highlighted this issue about various deadlines related to when people can buy extra national insurance years by. And one of the problems that comes up again and again when you listen to people who have, the case studies that he talks about, is they've tried to get that information, and it can be really hard, just to get through to somebody on the phone of HMRC or get an answer to correspondence. And so I think that's a really good example of why actually putting money into having a better run HMRC is good for everyone, as well as the extra revenue it can generate.
So let's talk about the other party leaders then. How are you finding Rishi Sunak from your personal point of view and from the Liberal Democrats' point of view?
I mean, it's just baffling, isn't it? I mean, it is so baffling. I mean, for any party leader, but perhaps particularly one, the leader of a party that so often likes to portray itself as being the patriotic party, to, come home early from the D-Day commemorations, absolutely baffling decision. But in a way, I think what we're being reminded of through this election is, he's somebody who ran against the leadership of the Tory party, and he lost. He's such a poor campaigner that he lost to Liz Truss of all people. And in a way, I think, it's perhaps not surprising that now being put to the test again as a campaigner, he just doesn't seem to be enjoying it. I mean, just look at the body language. Look at the clips of, him doing his election tour around the country compared to, Ed Davey. It's not just that, there are rather more stunts involved if you're looking what Ed's up to, but also you can just see in the body language, Ed is really enjoying the election. It really doesn't look like Rishi Sunak is enjoying it at all.
You've just touched there on the D-Day event that Rishi Sunak left early. So who do you think now is the party of patriotism?
Well, I think actually patriotism is an attribute shared by people all across the political spectrum, and also people who wouldn't view themselves as being a supporter of any particular party. I think that's the important sort of shared collective part of our country, and I think the Conservatives have often been quite almost divisive in their approach of sort of thinking that it's their way or nothing. And I think you have seen from politicians in all the other parties pretty much really a very sort of different approach, and recoiling in horror really at that real blunder by Rishi Sunak is so disrespectful.
And let's talk about Keir Starmer now, the Labour leader. How are you finding his campaign and Labour's campaign altogether?
I mean, you can understand why, when the polls show that the Conservatives are a long way behind Labour, that Labour seem to have this very super cautious, safety-first approach. But my goodness, it is a bit dull at times. And I think, there is that real risk for Labour that it's, they might be able to, in that sense, get away with it through till polling day, but just quite where that leaves them as in the future then, whether they will have that popularity in the bank to help see them through difficult times ahead, I think is a real question mark.
So I'm guessing you wouldn't encourage Ed Davey to go into coalition with the Labour Party then?
I mean, we're very much focused on trying to maximise the number of Liberal Democrat MPs that are elected, and the more Lib Dem MPs there are, the stronger our voice will be in Parliament, and we'll see what the public in its wisdom decides for the makeup of the rest of the Parliament.
Leaving your presidency of the Liberal Democrats behind just for this question, would you personally like to see your party go back into coalition, although this time with the Labour Party?
I mean, I certainly think, as the Liberal Democrats do, as a party that we need a better voting system for the House of Commons. We should have a fairer voting system based on proportional representation. And certainly one of the consequences, long term for that is that we'd be more likely to see coalition governments. And you can see from, for example, other countries in Europe actually just how beneficial that is. That we could get a lot more stability and long-term which is let's concentrate on getting as many Lib Dem MPs elected as possible, because that means there's as powerful a voice for the things that we believe in as possible.
So do you think you'd be able to work well with the Labour Party, even if you don't even go into coalition with them on many cross-party policies? You mentioned there a new voting system.
I mean, I think, Labour have been so cautious in so many areas that I think, if we do have a future Labour government, obviously looking at the polls at the moment, that looks more likely than not. There'll be an important role for the Liberal Democrats in terms of sort of pushing any future government to sort of do more and do better. And, you see that, as you mentioned, on, electoral reform, that Keir Starmer's made a few nice warm words about that in the past, but not really delivered on that in terms of, say, the Labour manifesto. So I think there's an important future role for the Lib Dems in British politics, definitely.
Why can none of the Liberal Democrats' senior leadership actually answer this question with clarity, whether or not your party would want to go back into a coalition deal?
Well, I think it's very reasonable to say let's concentrate on what we're about, trying to maximise the number of MPs that we get elected. And I think British politics in the last few years has shown how unpredictable and and chaotic and surprising and different turns of events can be. But I think the one thing we can be really clear about with the Lib Dems in this election is we're very clear. Our job is to play our part in getting the Conservatives out of government and to try to get as many Lib Dem MPs as possible elected.
And unpredictability it has been a running thing, especially in the polls in recent years, and you're obviously an expert on polling as well. So do you think polls are vital in election seasons?
Definitely. I think they provide a really valuable source of pretty accurate information. The polls are not always right, but certainly one of the great things about the polls normally being roughly right is that just provides the public and indeed the media and so on with a good understanding of what is really going on. And I think you see that particularly when there's a newspaper that, say, has a particular leaning, particular preference for one party, but the polls are actually showing that party is very unpopular. In a way, it almost helps keep that media coverage honest. The fact that we have this, fairly authoritative alternative source of information that's telling us what's really going on in the world.
And do you think that all polls are fair and balanced at all times?
I mean, I think there's definitely a bit of a range in quality of the pollsters in Britain, but we're actually pretty lucky compared to, say, the US, where there are real problems in the US with very questionable polling firms. But actually in Britain overall, it's in a pretty good situation, particularly because, to their credit, the polling industry and the British Polling Council, their sort of industry self-regulatory body, do a really good job of ensuring basic standards of transparency. So for each of the sort of voting intention polls that, you may hear talked about in the media or online, there's always the information available about what questions were asked, when they were asked, which company was used to ask them, and data tables giving all sorts of breakdowns behind the headline figures available on that company's website, usually pretty promptly after the voting figures first appear. And actually that's quite unusual, even for other well-established democracies with long-running polling industries. That level of transparency, sadly, perhaps isn't necessarily given by any means. And so I think that is something we can, in a sense, justifiably be proud of about polling in Britain.
Well, thank you for coming on, Mark. And can you just tell our listeners where to find you on social media?
Absolutely. You can find me at my weekly email newsletter about polling, The Week in Polls. If you Google or Bing that, you'll be able to sign up to that. And you can find me on Twitter or X at MarkPack, and with a similar handle on a variety of other social networks.
Well, thank you for coming on.
Lovely to talk to you. Thank you.
And now Mark has give his social medias out. I might as well give mine out. You can follow me on X at BillCurtis0. And we hope you enjoyed this podcast episode, this exclusive interview with the president of the Liberal Democrats for Politics UK. And of course, you can keep up to date with all our stuff on Twitter.